is not the only source of data that you can use if you're trying to optimize your decisions, if you're trying to optimize your design, the way you manage your systems, or how you operate them. Internal data is the most useful because it's the most telling about how your system is operating, but you can, of course, go externally and get information. Have any of you tried to go externally to get information to help you improve your decisions or your design of your systems internally? Yes-ish. Folks have. So the interesting thing about that is it's very useful to help you understand your performance in the context of others, for example, benchmarking. However, you can also incorporate them more directly into things like operations. You just have to convert the data into something that sort of aligns with your existing data set. And that's why we have so many statisticians in the world, and why data sharing programs are really complicated and difficult to kind of set up in ways that meet all the needs of the stakeholders. However, there's hope, which we're getting to in a moment. So I think this quote is kind of important for information security folks. There's a story about some philosophers or statisticians who were told to go look for some keys that had been lost in a parking lot. And someone walking by noticed that this guy was walking around in circles under a lamppost. It was really dark out, but he was really looking for that keys, but he was just going around and around. And someone said, "Why are you only looking in this one spot?" And he's like, "Oh, well, this is the only place where I can see the ground." And so when we communicate as security or risk professionals back up to management, management needs to have data that, or needs to have data expressed in ways that are quantifiable and feel really real to them. And so I think it's useful for us to consider new models and new approaches simply because the communication gap between assessment and defense there's a communication gap as well as a sort of an operational gap between assessment and defense. And the better we are able to communicate and use numbers and use the language of business, the more likely we are to be successful in the risk management programs that we put into place. So if you harvest your internal systems and use the data that you have there from all the feedback loops, that is one place to get data, but where else can you get data? Alex Hutton, do you have any ideas?
Thanks, I do. All right, so while I'm transitioning here, I just want to get a couple of concepts of what Allison said. I want to put them in the back of your mind for a second. First is patterns, right? I talked about how in terms of risk modeling, and if we are a complex system, you can only look and discern for patterns, which is a lot of what she was talking about. And so hold that one in the back of your mind. What I want to ask you now, though, is, all right, so I've put forth, that, governance is really just risk management, that governance is fair, what we think of as governance now in information security is fairly fabricated, probably by vendors. The second thing being our risk modeling is really terrible, at times impossible, it's completely uninformative, even when we do a good job in predicting and predictive analytics. What is the role of risk modeling in the future? We've given you, Allison started to give us a little bit of insight into that. It's actually talking about the systems. So, I work for Verizon in the risk intelligence group. We did release our data breach report today. This is something we did with the Secret Service. We now have 900 incidents that are represented in this report. It's really a fantastic piece of data and a fantastic work. And we're going to actually take the fact that we're sharing this, keep it open, and we're going to do something with it. One of the things that we had to do in terms of working with the Secret Service, and in fact working with our own people internally, is give them a framework. Take an incident narrative. First the bad guy did this, then that, then the other thing. Sort of like what Allison was showing you in her slide with the threat actions back to exfiltration and monetization. And we had to actually turn those into metrics. And what we created was a framework for this. It's called Veris, and it's open. It's as close to that I could get Verizon's legal team to give me a Creative Commons non-commercial share-alike attribute license. And basically, it's designed to create metrics out of these incident narratives. It has several parts. First, it's got a demographic part, whoops, which is simply, iPad gone wild, hold on a sec. All right, which is simply industry. That's very informative when you start collecting information. It's the size of the company. That gives us all sorts of indicators. The geographic location and the size of the security department. We use size of the security department because that kind of gives us a comparison between size of the organization, size of the security department in terms of full-time employees, and what kind of resources they're throwing against the information security problems and risk management problems that they have. There's an incident classification piece. We see an incident in terms of that narrative, the guy did this, then he did that, then he did the other thing, as a series of objects. They're events in time. Each object has 4 sets of metadata. It has an action, or an agent, an asset, an action, and an attribute. We use Don Parker's hexad, if you're familiar with that, in the attribute bits. We put these events together, and suddenly we have a modeled story of what the incident consisted of. We also do discovery and mitigation. That gives us informative data about the ability to detect and respond for the organization, and second level prevent. We all know prevent, detect, and respond is fractal, right? And an impact modeling section, classification schema. You take all that information together, and suddenly you have this set of Verus information that you can use. We have 900 of these sets of Verus information now. So we can start comparing each failure evidence together. And we can see, well, hey, B there was extremely similar to E. We can look for patterns that are that similar. We can even look for patterns that match specific demographic pieces and specific small threat pieces. So what does it mean to be post-GRC in the context of Verus? What we're looking at is evidence. It's evidence of what went wrong. If anybody familiar with the term evidence-based medicine? Here? I got one, I got two. All right, so evidence-based medicine, for those of you who don't know, is basically saying, okay, well, we're going to have scientific studies on what works and what doesn't, and what we are going to prescribe as a doctor is what works best. Evidence-based risk management would therefore be a CISO saying, hey, I'm going to prescribe what works best, or I'm not going to do those things that make me suck. These are expressed basically by models that we talked about. I want to give you a real-world example. Borrow Allison's system, and if you take my assertion that what we're dealing with is actually the entanglement of multiple complex systems, you've got problems. You've got a lot of data that you need to process. You've got a lot of things that you have to do. Now, what's interesting is we've been sitting here and we've been talking about models, we've been talking about statistics, we've made allusions to philosophers and so forth. Very highly academic. You'll forgive us for that. But I want you to know that this is not an academic pursuit. First off, I've been preaching the concept of data warehousing and business intelligence for use in security for several years now. Gartner finally issued a report and said, hey, this is going to be a big trend over the next 5 years. To that extent, I don't know of a lot of people doing it, but the ones I do know involve a large financial institution who has 50 terabytes of data from 60 different data sources. He's actually preventing Zeus infections and fraudulent ACH transfers by doing exactly what we're trying to tell you about here today. He's throwing away risk modeling as I'm going to go look at my enterprise, I'm going to do a vulnerability assessment, I'm going to try and figure out how bad all these things are. He's instead having his risk analysts integrate with operations and actually spawn processes that say, oop, this is not an ACH transfer that's going through. So he actually is actually, that specific organization is actually going to spool up to 110 different data sources and over 100 terabytes of information and some sort of Hadoop installation that I really need to learn about. And basically, it's just this information. Back to that deceptively simple Venn diagram that I gave you in the synthesis of that information. So if we're talking about the future, if we're going to throw off GRC and say, you know what, this doesn't make any sense at all. You talk about the future, this is what the future of risk analytics is. It's integration with operational security and the actual defense, not in the actual answering to IT audits and external auditors. So that leaves one problem, and that problem is this. The data owners themselves, the people that we report to, they really like these stoplights. They really like these individual point statements that we're asserting we can't really do, and so forth. They like the reporting. And so one of the things that I'm trying to wrap my mind around is, how do we report this? And what I wanted to actually talk about is drawing a lesson from something that might be familiar to some of you. This is Jose Cardinal. This is his 1978 Phillies card. It's one of my favorite cards for obvious reasons. But if you look on the back, and this is a Yogi Berra card, what they're actually giving you is a dashboard, right? You don't think of the back of a baseball card as a dashboard, but it is. And here you have an old Yogi Berra card, and you have basic information that tells you what kind of baseball player Yogi Berra is, right? As we got a little more sophisticated now, you see that there are many more statistics. And so you can look at games and at-bats, and you can tell if he's a full-time player. You can compare that in terms of games and say, okay, now he's not only a full-time player, but over the course of his history, and you know, we don't have history on Yogi there, right? He plays a bunch. He's always been a starter, and he does get hurt often, and he has some level of power, he has some level of strikeouts, he has some level of all of these things. And I'm sorry that this came out blurry a bit, but when you talk about Barry Bonds, now we have a very sophisticated history, a very sophisticated set of attributions about what kind of baseball player he was. And the red bits there, if you can just barely pick those out, that's where he led the league. So now you have this new thing called comparative analytics. Verizon's got 900 good, confident set of analytics for folks to compare against that we have released and will continue to work on in releasing. And in a framework that you can take and apply at home, absolutely free. There's a wiki, go use it, knock yourself out, we don't care, right? So if we have the ability to try and say, here's a notion of what kind of good baseball player Barry Bonds may or may not be, how can we do that for these? And my assertion is this: deconstruct it. I borrowed the concept of a balanced scorecard. I was inspired again by Andrew Jaquith and his book on security metrics. But I don't think the balanced scorecard that we should be applying, at least initially to understand whether or not we're doing a great job at managing risk and defending against threats, really is what you find in a regular balanced scorecard. I think what we simply do is deconstruct that Venn diagram and that risk model. We have 4 separate pieces. We have to understand what we're doing, the change in those, the variation from past and present, comparative analytics, which is why Verizon's saying here the stuff is free, right? And move forward, right? So a couple of interesting things happen if you take this approach, I believe. First off, capability measurements kind of destroys governance, right? We don't really care. We can see what effective patterns, what effective processes and procedures are by doing correlations against established patterns. Compliance really simply becomes a factor of the impact of the impact landscape, unless you're really concerned about how a specific compliance program can help you defend and its effectiveness in defense in your comparison against other folks. So the assertion here is that the post-GRC world will be ushered in by a couple of factors. First, data. Data applied by technology, like a data warehouse, things that actually spawn operational instances that help defend the enterprise. Very pragmatic. Second, reporting becomes something that we do by measuring a lot of things and using multiple models, not just one GRC.